Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today we're going to be talking about The Haunted Man and the Ghost Bargain by Charles Dickens. So The Haunted Man was Dickens's final Christmas novella, which he published in 1848. And we have been reading over the last few weeks Charles Dickens's Christmas books in publication order. If you want to know more about the Christmas Dickens Readalong or the Mega Dickens Readalong, I will leave some links down below. But it has been really fun rereading all of Dickens's Christmas books in chronological publication order over the last month and a bit. And it was nice to end on The Haunted Man because I love The Haunted Man a lot. So the first section of this video will be spoiler free, and then I will get into spoilers later on in the video. At the beginning of the novella, we meet a man called Mr. Redlaw. He is a scientist and a teacher, and he is really struggling at the moment. He is grieving for the loss of his sister, who he was very close to, and he's also thinking a lot about the past and the sorrows in his past and also in his sister's past. So we know from the beginning that many years ago, he had a best friend, a close friend, and his sister was in love with this man. It seemed that this man was also in love with his sister. Meanwhile, at a similar time, Redlaw was in love with another young woman, and then the best friend betrayed Redlaw's confidence, left his sister and married the young woman that Redlaw was in love with, leaving both Redlaw and his sister brokenhearted. Time passed, and Redlaw's sister has now died, and he is thinking a lot about the past and about his sister, and he is both sort of metaphorically haunted by grief and sorrow, and also literally haunted by a phantom version of himself who tempts him to give up and forget all the sorrows and suffering of his past. He says, I can take away all that pain, you can forget all your suffering. And Redlaw accepts the deal and agrees to forget all the pain and suffering that he has experienced in his life, not realising what that will mean. So in terms of my overall thoughts about The Haunted Man, I just think it's really good. So I listened to the audiobook narrated by Jonathan Keeble, which I thought was really well done. I think this is probably the third time I've read The Haunted Man, and I really like it. Like for me, when I think of Dickens's Christmas books, A Christmas Carol is definitely the best. And then The Haunted Man is next, and then the other three are like much less good. Like I do really like the Chimes and the Battle of Life and the Cricket on Hearth, but I do think like for me, A Christmas Carol and The Haunted Man are like on a different level. And I love The Haunted Man so much. I think it's really well done. Like I think it's the second best Dickens Christmas book, and I think it's really atmospheric, really clever, really powerful. It is one of Dickens's darker Christmas stories, but for me, I just think it's really strong. I think the premise and the themes are just really interesting, and it's really well done, and I love it a lot. I will say that not everyone who was participating in the Christmas Dickens Readalong on the Discord server loved it. I feel like a lot of people didn't love it very much. So maybe I am alone in my great love of The Haunted Man, but I do think it's really great, and I would encourage you to read it. Like I feel like of all of Dickens's Christmas books, you may well have already read A Christmas Carol, but if you are going to read any of the other four, The Haunted Man is the one to read. So turning to chronology and The Haunted Man's kind of place in Dickens's publication journey. So it was published in December 1848, so 2 years after the Battle of Life. So the previous four Christmas books were published 1 year after the other, and then there was a 2-year gap between the Battle of Life and The Haunted Man. During that time, Charles Dickens was writing and publishing Dombey and Son, so I think that's probably why there was a gap. But Dombey and Son was wrapped up by the point that he wrote The Haunted Man. So it's Dickens' final Christmas novella, like his final Christmas standalone book. He did write some Christmas stories after this, but mostly as part of collaborative works. So from the 1850s onwards, Charles Dickens was an editor of literary magazines, first Household Words, later All the Year Round. And in these magazines, for like the Christmas edition of the magazine, he would often produce a collaborative work with various other writers, which would often be like short stories within a frame narrative, and Dickens would often write the frame narrative and one of the short stories. So He continued writing those sort of Christmas stories, those things to be released around Christmas, but he didn't publish his sort of standalone volume form novellas. The Haunted Man was the final one of these 5 books, and it's definitely one of the darker ones. Probably reminds me most of the Chimes in that sense. Like, I feel like the Chimes and the Haunted Man are very, very dark, and both of them are a lot darker than the Cricket on the Hearth and the Battle of Life especially. It feels to me like the Haunted Man has a lot more in common with the Chimes and A Christmas Carol than it does with the Cricket on the Hearth and the Battle of Life, and it definitely feels like Dickens was returning to his older style of Christmas story. You know, like the Chimes and A Christmas Carol, it's very firmly set over the Christmas period. The supernatural magical element is very, very important to it, and we have a clear sort of like man needs to learn a big life lesson narrative going on, and the tone of it is a really big shift from sort of the Cricket on the Hearth and the Battle of Life. The main character Redlaw is grieving for the death of his sister, and actually Dickens's own sister died in September 1848, so just a few months before this was published. And in general, I'm not usually one for like using bits of the author's life to interpret a book. Like, I feel like books stand on their own, and sometimes I feel like people read too much into a book being about an author's life in a way that, like, as someone who writes, I find a bit ridiculous. So I try not to kind of do that too much with books that I'm reading. But obviously the sort of parallels between Dickens losing his sister and Redlaw losing his sister do feel quite close, and I do think it's interesting to look at The Haunted Man as a novella about grief written by someone who was writing it while grief was very fresh. You know, he must have been writing this in the weeks and months after her death, and I do feel like it is in many ways a novella about grief and about coming to terms with grief. So that is kind of worth knowing, I suppose. Although, you know, Dickens writes about grief in a lot of books. Anyway, to move on to sort of the plot and the premise of The Haunted Man. I feel like there's not that much I can say about the plot without spoilers, but I love the premise of The Haunted Man. I feel like for me, the premise and the message and the ideas within The Haunted Man are as good as A Christmas Carol, nearly. But I don't think the execution is quite as amazing. But I do still think it's really good. And for me, like I said, I really feel like The Haunted Man is like up on a level with A Christmas Carol, or like nearly there, in a way that the other 3 Christmas books just aren't. Like, I feel like it's Dickens's most interesting idea within his Christmas books, with the exception of A Christmas Carol. And I feel like it's just really interesting. So yeah, there's so many great elements of the plot, you know, the phantom and the way that works, and the whole idea of the gift and sort of forgetting sorrow and suffering. The element of the little urchin boy is really effective. Millie's role in the story is great. The role of the Tetterbees is quite interesting. Mr. Redlaw's character development over the course of the book, like, I just think it works really well, and it's such an interesting premise and such an interesting idea. Like, when I read The Christmas Carol, I'm like, what a genius idea, and when I read The Haunted Man, I'm like, what a genius idea, in a way that I just don't feel when I read the other 3 Christmas books. Let me talk a bit about the characters, because I do think the characterization is really strong in The Haunted Man. Redlaw, I think, is a really interesting character. He's very interestingly drawn, and the sort of shifts in him over the course of the novella are really fascinating to follow. The nameless little boy who Redlaw encounters is a really interesting character, and obviously he is a bit of a symbol within the book, a stand-in for poverty and for children who are abandoned by society and who have nothing. He almost feels to me like a sort of real life version of the phantom children Ignorance and Wants from A Christmas Carol, and I feel like he is a really significant part of the story. I really love Millie as well, and her role in the story is really interesting. Yes, she is a little bit like Victorian Angel in the House, and yes, within The Haunted Man there's definitely a strong strand of that Victorian idea that women are sort of more innately moral than men, and therefore must be responsible for the morality of men, which, you know, Ruskin and various other thinkers subscribe to, and I find very frustrating. There definitely is a little bit of that within Millie, but I think there's a lot more than that in Millie too. And there's a lot of other interesting things with her character and her role in the story that I'll talk about later. I think the young student Edmund is quite interesting. I really like the Tetterbees, and there's a lot of like great eccentric characters within The Haunted Man as well. I always love a good Dickens eccentric, and we have Philip, William's father, who is very keen to remind everyone that he is 87 and he's very proud of the fact. And we have William himself, who constantly like pretends to interpret what Mr. Redlaw is trying to say, but in a completely different way. I've already mentioned the Tetterbees as a whole, but I love Johnny and the baby. Johnny and the baby are excellent. I thoroughly enjoy them throughout the story. The Haunted Man has quite a big cast for its size, but for me it works really well. So let's move on to the themes, which are probably the most like interesting thing within The Haunted Man. There's a little bit I can say without spoilers, and then we'll go into spoilers in a bit. But first, keeping it spoiler free, I wanted to talk a bit about the themes of sort of poverty and neglect within The Haunted Man, because we see quite a lot of images of people in poverty, in difficult situations throughout the book, across quite a big spectrum. So we have a family like the Tetterbees, who are sort of a similar social economic position to the Cratchits in A Christmas Carol. They are struggling to make ends meet, especially with a large family. They're just about managing, but they definitely at times wish they could be wealthier. And then we also have someone sort of right at the bottom of the scale, like that little nameless boy who just has absolutely nothing, who has so little in life and who has struggled so much in life that he almost has been stripped of his humanity. So I'll read the first description we have of the little boy. A bundle of tatters held together by a hand, in size and form almost an infant's, but in its greedy, desperate little clutch, a bad old man's. A face round and smooth by some half-dozen years, but pinched and twisted by the experiences of a life. Bright eyes, but not youthful. Naked feet, beautiful in their childish delicacy, ugly in the blood and dirt that cracked upon them. A baby savage, a young monster, a child who had never been a child, a creature who might live to take the outward form of a man, but who, within, would live and perish a mere beast. Used already to be worried and hunted like a beast, the boy crouched down as he was looked at and looked back again, and interposed his arm to ward off the expected blow. I'll bite, he said, if you hit me. There's something so deeply upsetting about the first image we get of this child. Both the fact that this little, like, 6-year-old boy has been stripped of his humanity by the way the world has treated him, but also the fact that, like, his instinct when he sees another person is to think they're going to hit him. And he immediately goes into self-defense mode because that's the life he lives. And I just think it's so, like, utterly tragic. You know, this boy's life has been all misery because he has nothing. He has no family. He has no money. He has no home. He has nothing and no one to care for him until he meets Millie and gets a little bit of kindness from her, the first kindness anyone has ever really shown him. And I feel like the social criticism within the depiction of that little boy is really powerful and really effective and impactful, and one of the really interesting things within The Haunted Man. Another theme within the novella is definitely that of family. We have a more sort of traditional nuclear family within the Tetterbees, but then we also have the sprawling family of the Swidgers, with William and Mary, William's father, and all their various relations. Meanwhile, Redlaw is alone, grieving for the loss of his sister with no other family around him, and the little boy too suffers from his lack of any kind of family. And so I think within the novel, there's this real emphasis on sort of the importance of family, whether that is family by blood or by affection, the importance of family to help you through sorrow, and to give you what you need in life is kind of really important within The Haunted Man. One really important theme within The Haunted Man is that of memory. Obviously, this is a novella about a man making a deal with a phantom to lose a lot of his memories. So you might imagine that memory is a big theme in the book. And we kind of see from the very beginning in that first scene, we have the contrast between Philip Swidger, who is 87 years old, very proud of his good memory and all the things he remembers from all his 87 years, contrasted with Redlaw, who just wants to forget. So I think I'm going to move into spoiler territory now. So if you haven't read The Haunted Man, do head on away. But if you have, do stick around. I have many more things to say. So continuing with the theme of memory. Memory is obviously bound up with a lot of other themes in the novel and with its central premise. When Redlaw loses his memory of pain and suffering, he effectively loses all his emotional sensibility. He loses his ability to empathise or sympathise with others, and he loses most of his positive emotions as well as losing his negative ones. I think part of what Dickens is saying here is that emotions, you know, negative and positive emotions are too tied up together to be separated. So for Redlaw to forget the pain of losing his sister, he has to forget how much he loved his sister. He has to forget everything good about her and everything good that she added to his life. And without those memories of her, how can he really be the same person at all? And how can he feel for others? Redlaw begins to spread this so-called gift of memory loss like a plague. He infects the Tetterbys, and when Mr. and Mrs. Tetterby forget everything they've struggled through together, they stop loving each other. And when Edmund forgets the suffering of his illness, he can no longer appreciate the kindness Millie showed him while he was ill. And on it goes. When the characters within this novella lose their memories of sorrow and suffering, they lose their ability to truly empathise, and they lose their kindness and their pity, and they stop valuing those around them. The only person who isn't negatively affected by all this is the little boy, whose life has been nothing but suffering and sorrow. He has no comparison of suffering with joy, so by losing his memories of suffering, he loses nothing valuable. He's also suffered so much, and there's never been anything good in his suffering. His suffering is just cruelty, in a way that isn't the case for someone like Redlaw, who is grieving for the loss of his sister. He's grieving for something he's lost that he once had, whereas the little boy has never had anything good to lose. He hasn't loved and lost or struggled and got through tough times. His life has just all been pain. He's been stripped of his humanity by society and the world, and so he has nothing left to lose. And this kind of ties into the themes within the novel of sympathy and empathy and suffering and sorrow. We were talking a bit on the Discord server about kind of what the central message is of The Haunted Man. I think there are a couple of different ways of reading the central message. I think the less pleasant way of reading it is that Dickens is saying sort of people have to suffer to be good, kind people. But I don't think that's what he's trying to say. That's not how I've ever read it. You know, the very fact that we have this little boy who has experienced nothing but sorrow and isn't kind is just lashing out and angry and miserable, because of course he is. I don't think the message is you must suffer to be a good person. I think the message is basically like better to have loved than to have lost than to have never loved at all. And that, you know, everyone suffers at some point in life. Like, every life has something difficult and sad in it. And if you were to forget all that sadness, if you were to refuse to feel that sadness, how could you possibly ever be the same person? You know, bonds between people get formed in sorrow. Affection is strengthened by shared pain. And if you were to forget all the sad things that had ever happened in your life, you would also have to forget the happiness and the affection, because they will be tied up together. And sometimes it is okay to be sad. And this all ties in with the main theme of the novella, which is, I think, the theme of grief. You know, for me, The Haunted Man is a story about processing grief, accepting grief, allowing yourself to feel grief, because it is healthy to feel grief, rather than try to forget it. You know, here we have a man, Redlaw, who is deeply grieving for his sister and just wants to forget. But when he does forget, he realises the harm and damage that that does, and how much better it would have been for him to let himself remember his sister and love her and treasure the memories of what they shared before she died, rather than trying to forget her entirely. I think it's really significant that the only character who is immune to Redlaw's sort of plague of memory loss is Millie. I think there are a few different interpretations to why Millie is the one exception. You know, one of them is, you know, that sort of angelic angel in the house, women as moral beacons, theory of several Victorian thinkers. But, you know, there are other female characters who are affected by Redlaw's gift, so I don't think it is solely that. I think the real reason why Millie is immune is because of her own grief, and because she has processed her own grief in a healthier way. So we know that Millie and her husband William don't have any children, and that they had a child who was born dead. And it's the grief that Millie has for her child that she still carries with her, that sort of protects her. Her grief for her child is so strong and so bound up with love and pity and understanding for others. It means she is immune to this plague that Redlaw is spreading. I'm going to try and read some of Millie's speech, if I can get to the end of it without crying. I do find The Haunted Man exceptionally emotional, and when I was listening to it and finishing it off on audiobook, I just like cried through the last like 20 minutes. I think it's really emotional. So, okay. It is a comfort to me. It speaks to me in so many ways. That innocent thing that never lived on earth is like an angel to me. When I think of all those hopes I built upon it, and many times I sat and pictured to myself the little smiling face upon my bosom that never lay there, and the sweet eyes turned up to mine that never opened to the light, I can feel a great tenderness, I think, for all the disappointed hopes in which there is no harm. When I see a beautiful child in its fond mother's arms, I love it all the better, thinking that my child might have been like that, and might have made my heart as happy and proud. For poor neglected children, my little child pleads as if it were alive, and had a voice I knew with which to speak to me. When I hear of youth in suffering or shame, I think that my child might have come to that, perhaps, and that God took it from me in his mercy. Even in age and grey hair, such as father's, it is present, saying that it too might have lived to be old, long and long after you and I were gone, and to have needed the respect and love of younger people. Children love me so that sometimes I half fancy, it's a silly fancy, William, they sometimes have some way I don't know of feeling for my little child and me, and understanding why their love is precious to me. And Millie, by accepting her grief and loving the child she lost, by remembering that suffering and trying to move past it and accept it as part of her life rather than forget it as Redlaw does, she is at peace and she is kind and loving to others, and that is why she is immune to Redlaw's influence, I think, why she is the one able to restore Redlaw's memory, why she is the only one with influence over the little nameless boy. It is because she, unlike Redlaw, has been able to accept and process her grief, and that is what Redlaw needs to do. And in that way, like, yes, a lot of the central message of the book is about kind of how memory of suffering and sorrow can help us empathize. I also feel like the message of the book is also about like why it's healthy to process grief and not just try and forget it, which I do think is quite powerful. I like to think that after the end of the book, William and Millie go on to adopt the little nameless boy and give him a better life. She is the only person that seems to have any influence over the little boy, the only person the little boy seems to have any affection for or instinct towards. And there's this bit at the end about him and all the children. It was sad to see the child who had no name or lineage, watching the other children as they played, not knowing how to talk with them or sport with them, and more strange to the ways of childhood than a rough dog. It was sad, though in a different way, to see what an instinctive knowledge the youngest children there had of his being different from all the rest, and how they made timid approaches to him with soft words and touches, and with little presents, that he might not be unhappy. But he kept by Millie, and began to love her. And as they all liked her dearly, they were glad of that. And when they saw him peeping at them from behind her chair, they were pleased that he was so close to it. And here we see this little boy whose life has been nothing but sorrow and pain, learning to love another human being for the very first time in his life. And that's going to change his life and help him get back the humanity that society has slowly stripped from him. So I don't think there's much else left to say. I just love The Haunted Man. I think it's so powerful and so beautiful and such a wonderful story about working through grief and why it's like okay and healthy to be sad sometimes. And I just think it's really, really good. Before I finish, I will do a very quick ranking of Charles Dickens's Christmas novellas. So I think at number 5, my least favourites on this reread was The Cricket on the Hearth, which I think always used to be more in the middle, but no, that goes at the bottom this time. Then probably The Battle of Life at number 4, then The Chimes at number 3, then The Haunted Man at number 2 as my second favourite, and then A Christmas Carol reigns supreme because it is just the best and it is fantastic. I think The Chimes definitely went up in my estimation on this reread, and The Cricket on the Hearth went down. It's hard with The Chimes because I basically feel like both The Cricket on the Hearth and The Battle of Life probably execute what they're trying to do better, but I just feel like what The Chimes is trying to do is more interesting, and I feel like The Chimes is one I will get a lot more out of, like every time I reread it, in a way that I don't necessarily think I will with The Cricket on the Hearth or The Battle of Life, especially The Cricket on the Hearth. But I do really enjoy them all, and yes, especially A Christmas Carol and The Haunted Man. I just think The Haunted Man is so good. So yes, I hope you have enjoyed listening to me chat about The Haunted Man. I do think it's really, really interesting. I was having a think, and we were having a talk over on the Discord server about what fun Dickens/Victorian things we could do next Christmas. I think basically a few people were saying, oh, it'd be nice to reread some of the Christmas Dickens novellas again, because some of them do feel like they need a few readings to understand them, especially The Chimes, and maybe The Haunted Man slightly too. And we're also talking about Dickens's sort of collaborative Christmas books, the Christmas editions of Household Words and All the Year Round. And then I was also thinking about how much I loved reading The Christmas Hirelings by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. So maybe next year, rather than doing like a Christmas Dickens read-along, I'll do like a Victorian Christmas read-along, and we'll read like one Christmas novella, one Victorian collaborative Christmas magazine edition, and one like other Victorian Christmas book. I feel like that could be quite fun, so I'm gonna have a think about that. There's like 11 months to work that out, so yeah. That's all for now. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for taking part in the Christmas Dickens read-along. If you did, do let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.